Good day, friends. Great to have you at Keystone again. Last week we kicked off a series on Jonah and we discovered some amazing truths. One of the truths being is that when God is up to something and it doesn't make any sense to us, whether it be through our circumstances and from our vantage point, we might think, gee, this is unfair or can't see any good in it anyway. When we find ourselves in situations like that or circumstances, we can tend to think that God doesn't really know what he's doing, and we can make the decision that we know best and God doesn't really know best. And in that moment, when we make that decision to think that we know best, we can drift from God and we move away from the presence of God. And when we begin to drift from the presence of God and move away from the presence of God, what we discovered as well is that we have an enemy who always prepares for us these enticing ships that take us away from the presence of God. Like we did with Jonah, there was always going to be a ship to Tarshish. But when we jump on that ship and we embark on that ship and we move away from the presence of God, what we learned is that life tends to go down, 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 just as it did with Jonah. He went down to Joppa, he went down beneath the deck and he lay down. It's an indication to you and I is that as we move away from the presence of God, life goes down for us. More so than that, as life goes down is what we discover as we move away from the presence of God, is we can put the lives of others at risk. Those in and around us, just as Jonah put the lives of the sailors at risk and in great danger because of his moving away from the presence of God. But lastly, what we discovered is that we have an amazing God who's a gracious God, and a God who will sometimes send storms into our lives to wake us from our slumber, not to punish us in any way, but always to bring us back. Not for retribution, but always for restoration. So today we're going to pick up the story and we're going to touch on a truth that is often passed over. It's an amazing truth, which we're going to dig deep into. But before we get to that, I want us just to see how the book of Jonah is written in two symmetrical halves. What you'll find is in chapter 1, verse 1 is the word of the Lord came to Jonah, arise and go to Nineveh. And in chapter 3, in the second half, is you'll find the word of the Lord comes to Jonah, arise. And it's written in two symmetrical halves. The first half is Jonah's flight from God. And the second half deals with his mission to Nineveh. And each of these halves has three different sections where the word of the Lord comes to Jonah. The second part of it is where he encounters pagans, people of different religions and races. And the third part of each half is where you find Jonah talking to God again. What it's pointing out to us, and it's beginning to uncover for us, is one of the major themes, is that on two occasions in the book, Jonah encounters pagan people of different religion and a different race. And his attitude and approach toward them on both occasions is dismissive and unhelpful. And in actual fact, what you find is their character is more admirable than his. And we begin to uncover this amazing truth in God's heart. It is that God cares about the way that we treat people of different races and religions. It's that God would want us to be able to treat people who are different to us, maybe of a different faith and a different race, in a way that is loving, generous, kind, respectful, and just. And so we're going to tap into verses 5 to 10 in Jonah 1, and we're going to begin to unpack this truth. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. This was an incredible storm. Verse 5, the mariners were afraid. They were terrified, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, You sleeper, arise, call out to your God. Perhaps God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. And they said to one another, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, tell us on whose account that this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? And where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? And he said to them, I am the Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. First thing I want us to see here is what Hugh Martin would describe, is notice how the sailors are very alert and they are terrified because they see the reality of the storm. They're alert to reality. They know the danger that is upon them all, but they are terrified. And yet here you find Jonah, he is fast asleep below the deck. It is a strange time to be sleeping. But for many of us, what you might find is you're familiar with it. Some people have experienced this. It's what Hugh Martin would describe as the sleep of sorrow. It's a desire to escape reality through sleep. You see, what had happened to Jonah is there were great emotions going on in him. He was overwhelmed by emotions of anger, of guilt, of grief, of anxiety. And he was overwhelmed, and it drove him just to, let me just go to sleep and put my head on a pillow and escape reality just for a brief moment. And many of us possibly have had moments like that in your life. It is where you just want to get away from the reality of the storm of life. And so you find a pillow and enter into a deep sleep. Sometimes this can be unhelpful because you disconnect from reality. Solomon would write us that there's a time for everything. There's a time for mourning. David, I remember, he was overwhelmed with the emotions of guilt and grief because he had lost his son. His son was taken from him as a result of a grave sin which he committed with Bathsheba, which resulted in a culmination of several sins. And in the end, he lost his son. Just emphasizing the story or the truth that when we drift from God and we enter into a path which moves away from the presence of God, we put the lives of others at great risk around us. And David lost his son, and he entered a time of grief and grieving with great emotion. But then there came a time when he needed to get up and arise and come out of that slumber, so to speak. And so what he did is he lifted himself up, overcoming his emotions of guilt, of grief, of anxiety, of loss. And he took a shave, he washed, and he came out of his chambers, ready to take on life again. And it speaks to you and I that there are times when we need to come out of our slumber. There is a time to process and to grieve, but there's a time we're to come out of our chambers and out of our slumbers and to arise with God and to take on life and to look at the reality of the storm. I want you to also notice here is the contrast between the sailors and Jonah. You'll see this amazing contrast. You find Jonah asleep, but then you see the sailors alert, and in touch with reality. Jonah's asleep and out of touch with reality. Jonah's absorbed with his own problems and himself. And the sailors are concerned for the good of everyone. Jonah's not praying, but you find the sailors praying, each calling out to their own God. Okay, it might not be the true God, but they're attempting to apply faith and to pray. And Jonah's just not praying at all. Jonah's oblivious to the divine nature of the storm, and these sailors are aware that this storm is something that is not natural. It has a divine nature. Jonah, you find, who's narrow-minded, But the sailors are open-minded and even open to praying to the God of Jonah, our true God. You see the startling contrast, the carefully constructed contrast between Jonah and the sailors. And you have this captain who comes in and he wakes up Jonah and he says, "Arise, arise." These were the very same words that God came to Jonah with in the beginning of the book, if you remember. He said, "Arise, O son of Amittai, go to Nineveh, arise." It's the very same word. And here, out of a pagan sailor, the captain, comes the words of God, the same words. What is this? I mean, Jonah's the prophet who's meant to be calling the pagans and pointing them toward God. And yet here you find the pagan captain calling the prophet and pointing him toward God. What is this? You see this carefully constructed contrast between Jonah and the sailors. Even when they discover, they cast lots, which probably would have been names on sticks, and each time Jonah's stick is drawn, he draws the short straw every time his name comes out. And even when they discover that it's on his account, fleeing from the presence of the Lord, that they are in such danger, and this storm threatens their lives, they don't see this as a license to kill him. Do you see their character? They still try to find a way not to do him harm. They treat him with the utmost respect, and they treat his God with respect. You see, what we need to see here is on every occasion, they outshine him. They outshine him at every moment in this story. The captain comes to Jonah and rebukes him. He says, "I can see you're a man of faith. Why aren't you applying this faith? Why aren't you drawing on your spiritual resources for the public good?" We're all in the same boat here. This storm is threatening all of our lives. Why aren't you practically offering any help by throwing some of the cargo overboard? And why aren't you drawing on any spiritual resources that you have and spiritually not helping? You see, I want to read you a quote from Jacques Ellul, how he puts this. "These Joppa sailors are pagans, or in modern times, non-Christians. But the lot of the non-Christians and the Christians is linked. They are in the same boat. The safety of all depends on what each does. They are in the same storm, Christians and non-Christians, subject to the same peril, Christians and non-Christians, and they want the same outcome, Christians and non-Christians. And this ship typifies our situation." You see, my friends, we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat. Jonah had been positioned in the community of the sailors. There was one storm, but that one storm threatened all. You see, when we live in a community which is plagued by maybe crime, poor health, an economic crisis, it affects us all. It affects us all. You see, what God is wanting Jonah to see is to see himself as part of the whole human community and not just a part of the faith community. You see, we as Christians need to see ourselves that we're in the same boat, we're all in the same, but we need to see ourselves as part of the whole human community, as not as some separate sect, just in the faith community. That God has called us to faith, but it's to have an impact, and we're to come out of our narrow-minded thinking and to have an impact and be part of the greater whole human community. That is what God is waking Jonah up to, is that he deeply cares. He deeply cares about all humans. He deeply cares that every human is intrinsically, fearfully, and wonderfully made in the image of God. And we need to see ourselves as part of the whole human community and not as some separate sect. You see, Jonah here in this situation is practically no good. Spiritually, he's not drawing on any spiritual resources that he has access to in God for the greater good and for the concern of the community. He is merely absorbed with himself. You see, the captain was rebuking Jonah, but really this is a rebuke to the church. Jonah deserved his rebuke. Do we as the church need to own that rebuke? Are we merely concerned with ourselves, as Jonah was, and not concerned with the entire human community? You see, the way Tim Keller put it was like this. Jonah's private faith was of no public good. You see, the world in today's times is crying out and asking, where is God? But maybe the real question is, where are the people of God? You see, what the gospel does to you and I is it awakes us from our slumber. It awakens us, as Paul would write in Ephesians. And there's an exhortation to you and I in Ephesians 5 verse 14. It says, arise, arise, arise. Same words given to Jonah. Arise, and the glory of the Lord will shine upon you. The Lord will shine upon you. It's our time to arise. It's our time to come out of our slumber, because what the gospel does in you and I is it embeds us with the Spirit of Jesus. The very Spirit of Jesus. Which one awakens us from our deep, deep sleep. It brings us in touch with the reality of the storm that is out there. It moves us out of our self-absorption, where we become selfless and concerned for the greater good. It moves us to pray and not to sit asleep and not praying. Where we no longer are oblivious to the reality and the nature of the storm of life, where eternity and heaven and hell become real to you and I, and we sense the urgency of it. And we become vastly aware of situations around us. It moves us out of our narrow-mindedness and broadens our minds to discover the heights, the depths, the breadth, the width, and of the love of God for all of creation. And it brings us into God's plan of restoration for all people, for He loves all people, evidenced to us by Jesus' death on a cross. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that all who believe in Him shall have eternal life. Friends, will you grasp this amazing gospel and allow the Spirit of God to awaken your soul, to lift you from your slumber? Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.